Airport security cracked a black father across the arm with their baton while he carried his child. Moments later, the judge walked through the terminal and froze the whole scene in silence. What happens next will leave you speechless. They struck a father with a baton, breaking his arm as he held his child, certain no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe no badge is above the law. Darnell Rhodes adjusted the baby carrier strapped to his chest as he stepped into the bright, echoing expanse of Eastway International Airport. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a clinical glow across the polished tile floor. Malik stirred against him, his infant son wrapped snugly in a soft blue blanket, his tiny fist clutching a fold of his father's jacket. The terminal buzzed with motion, families dragging oversized luggage, flight announcements chiming through distant speakers, business travelers walking briskly with phones pressed to their ears. But for Darnell, time moved heavier. Every step toward the departure gate felt like a march through molasses, each footfall loaded with anxiety, memory, and silent resolve. Malik began to fuss, his small cries rising into the noise. Darnell instinctively bounced him gently, whispering, "It's okay, little man." Just a little longer, his voice was soft, more to himself than the child. He tightened his grip, his broken heart aching under the surface. Today wasn't just about a flight, it was about proving he was enough. He kept his eyes low, not out of shame, but out of strategy. A black man alone in an airport carrying a baby in a duffel bag, he had lived long enough to know what that looked like to certain people. And today, of all days, he couldn't afford attention. But attention found him anyway. Two uniformed airport security officers stood near the TSA checkpoint, arms folded, watching the crowd with narrowed eyes. Officer Darren Cole leaned toward his partner, Mitchell Sykes, a taller man with a square jaw and expressionless stare. Darren's eyes tracked Darnell as he moved toward the line, his brows furrowed at the baby's growing cries. "You see that?" Darren muttered. Mitchell followed his gaze. "Yeah, he looks nervous." Darren tilted his head, his mouth curling slightly. "Something's off." Darnell didn't notice them at first. He was focused on navigating the winding barrier lines, gently rocking Malik as the baby's whimpers turned into louder cries. People in the queue shifted uncomfortably, a few casting glances his way, some annoyed, others merely curious. Behind him, a young couple with headphones in gave him space. Ahead, an older man with a neck pillow sighed dramatically and turned his back. Darnell kept his eyes forward, murmuring, "Almost there, buddy." "We're gonna make it. Just hold on." The terminal air grew thinner somehow. A pit opened in Darnell's stomach when he caught movement from the corner of his eye, two officers walking toward him with purpose. His grip on Malik tightened reflexively. The baby cried louder, sensing the rising tension in his father's body. Darren stepped directly into Darnell's path, his tone sharp and laced with authority. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." Darnell blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Is something wrong?" he asked, keeping his voice even, respectful. Mitchell flanked the other side, eyeing Darnell's duffel bag like it was a ticking bomb. "You seem nervous. Where are you headed?" "Crestwood," Darnell replied quickly. "Flight 228. I have a custody hearing tomorrow morning. Important one." Darren's brow lifted. "What's in the bag?" "Just formula, diapers, some documents for the hearing," Darnell answered. "You can check if you need." "We will," Darren interrupted, already stepping forward. "Open it." Now Darnell hesitated, shifting Malik slightly. "I just need to get to the gate. My hands are kind of full, as you can see." "Then make it work," Mitchell snapped, his tone darker now. "Or are you refusing?" "No, sir," Darnell said quickly, adjusting his position to kneel while still holding Malik. "I'll do it. Just give me a second." He unzipped the bag slowly, revealing the mundane contents he'd described: baby wipes, a bottle, a tattered manila folder with court papers, and a pacifier tucked into a sock. Darren reached in without asking, flipping through the folder. "These documents legit?" he asked, though the tone implied doubt, not curiosity. "They're court-certified," Darnell replied. "That's why I can't miss this flight." The baby let out another sharp cry, his face flushed now. Darnell bounced him again, the rhythm faltering under the weight of the officer's scrutiny. Passengers around them slowed, casting sidelong glances, but none stopped. "Sir, why are you sweating?" Mitchell asked. "Because I'm holding a crying baby. I'm being stopped by security, and I'm trying to make a flight that could change my son's life," Darnell said, voice firm but not raised. Darren narrowed his eyes. We've had people pretend to be parents before. You got ID for this kid? Darnell stiffened. He's my son. Didn't ask that. Asked if you have ID. No, he's a baby. So, nothing proving it's yours? I just buried his mother, Darnell said quietly. I'm the only parent he's got left. Darren exchanged a look with Mitchell. It was the kind of glance that didn't need words, just judgment. Malik wailed louder, the sound bouncing through the high ceilings. You need to calm him down, Mitchell said harshly. I'm trying, Darnell snapped, then immediately softened his tone. Please, just let me go. I'll miss the flight. Darren stepped closer, his voice cold now. You're making a scene. That's a problem. I'm not trying to, Darnell said, backing slightly into the rope barrier. Just trying to get to the gate. Then comply, Darren said, his hand moving toward his belt. Now. Darnell's heart thundered. He could feel the shift. This wasn't about safety anymore. It was about control. He adjusted Malik, holding the baby closer to his chest like a shield, even as his own body began to tremble. Mitchell barked, Drop the attitude and give us the baby. Darnell's eyes went wide. No, no way. That wasn't a request, Darren said, stepping forward. A heavy silence fell between them. Darnell's muscles coiled, but he didn't run. He didn't argue further. He just held on tighter, his mind racing with the horror of what this might become. All he wanted was to make it to Crestwood and prove that he was the kind of father his son deserved. But now, the eyes of power were on him, and they didn't see a father. They saw a threat. Somewhere behind him, a boarding call echoed faintly. Gate 14. That was his flight. But he couldn't move. Darren and Mitchell were closing in. The air buzzed with quiet danger, and Malik kept crying. Darnell's pulse spiked. He tried to speak, to ask for patience, but the words stuck in his throat. Darren's eyes hardened. Mitchell's hand hovered near his baton. Darnell took one final breath, whispering to his son, I got you. No matter what, he didn't know that, across the terminal, someone was already watching, someone who would change everything. What started as a trip to prove his worth as a father was about to turn into a battle for survival. Why do you look so nervous? Darren's voice cracked through the air like the snap of a whip. Darnell froze mid-step. The question wasn't delivered with curiosity. It was laced with accusation, suspicion dripping from each syllable. His grip tightened around Malik, who whimpered against his chest. The infant's face flushed from crying. Darnell slowly turned toward the two security officers, his eyes scanning their uniforms, their rigid stances, the way their hands hovered too close to their belts. Mitchell stood slightly behind Darren, arms crossed, jaw tight. His eyes flicked to the blue baby blanket, then to the backpack slung over Darnell's shoulder. I'm just trying to make my flight, Darnell said calmly, though his throat was dry. My son's tired. We've had a long morning, Mitchell stepped forward. Bag, he demanded. Open it. Darnell paused. He wanted to avoid escalation, but his instinct told him this wasn't about protocol. He slowly slid the backpack off his shoulder, his movements deliberate. It's just baby stuff. Formula, diapers, legal papers for a custody hearing, Darren scoffed. You people always have a story. Darnell's stomach clenched at the phrase. He unzipped the bag, revealing exactly what he said. Bottles, a rolled-up blanket, a folder with court-stamped documents. Darren snatched the folder and flipped it open, pretending to read, then tossed it back without care. Malik began to fuss louder, twisting in Darnell's arms. Sir, Darnell said gently, keeping his voice even, we're not trying to cause trouble. Please, my gate is right there. But Mitchell stepped in front of him, blocking the path. You're acting jumpy. You hiding something else? No, Darnell replied, struggling to keep his tone respectful. I just want to get through. Darren leaned in, eyes narrowing. Then stop being uncooperative. I'm not, Darnell said, heart thudding. I answered every question. I'm holding my baby. The baby let out a sharp, high-pitched cry. Passengers glanced over from nearby gates, a few pausing mid-step, but most moved along, pretending not to see. The airport's white tile floors gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the still forms of the growing confrontation. A distant announcement about boarding zones barely registered. Look, Darnell continued, shifting Malik in his arms. I'm not resisting anything. Just let me pass. Darren's patience snapped. With no warning, he grabbed Darnell by the front of his coat and shoved him backward, slamming his back into a nearby column. The thud echoed across the terminal. Darnell gasped as pain jolted through his spine, instinctively turning his body to protect Malik. The baby squealed in panic, his tiny fingers grasping for his father's shirt. "Don't drop him," Darnell breathed, clutching the baby tighter with both arms. "Please, he's just a baby." Darren raised his voice. "You're resisting an order." "You want this to go worse?" Mitchell hovered nearby, not stepping in, not stopping it. His silence was complicity. Darnell tried again to diffuse, voice shaking now. "You've made your point. I'll sit. I'll wait. Just don't hurt my son." But the fear on his face wasn't enough to cool Darren's fire. The officer's eyes flared, not with duty, but with something colder, harder, a need to dominate. Malik's cries grew frantic, echoing off the high ceilings, drawing more attention. A teenager with a phone pretended to text but had started recording. An elderly man stood frozen by the vending machines. No one intervened. Darnell's mind raced. Every second standing here pressed to the wall like a criminal was a second further from the courtroom, further from proving he could be Malik's guardian. And yet, how could he leave if he couldn't move? How could he defend his right to be a father when he wasn't even allowed to hold his child in peace? "Sir," Darnell tried once more, "I'm not a threat. I'm a father." Darren didn't respond with words this time. His body did the talking. He stepped forward again, this time shoving his arm into Darnell's shoulder, sending him stumbling off balance. Darnell used every muscle to keep from dropping Malik, his knees buckling as he twisted to protect the infant. His backpack tumbled to the floor with a loud slap, its contents scattering. A bottle rolled toward a line of chairs and bumped against a traveler's boot. No one picked it up. The tension rippled outward. The air in the terminal thickened. Darnell could feel it. The slow, heavy realization that he was no longer simply being questioned. He was being accused, judged, punished, all without cause. And still, no one stepped in. He met Darren's eyes. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice ragged. Darren sneered. "Compliance. I'm holding a baby." "You heard me." Mitchell's hand twitched at his side. He looked around nervously, aware that people were watching now. He said nothing. Darnell adjusted his grip on Malik. The baby's screams had shifted into a choking sob, his little body trembling with fear. Darnell could feel the sweat on his son's neck, feel the fear radiating off him like heat. Then came the moment, the one that would be burned into every recording, every eyewitness account, every news story yet to be written. Darren took a step forward, hand reaching again toward Darnell's chest. "No," Darnell said, backing into the wall. "Don't touch him." "Then drop him," Darren growled, "and comply." Darnell's jaw tightened. He didn't move. Darren's fist closed. And then, the baby let out a piercing cry, louder than before, the kind of sound that slices through noise like a siren. Darren paused mid-reach. Darnell's eyes filled with helpless fury. Around them, the whispers began. "Someone stop him," a voice muttered nearby. But the officers didn't stop. They advanced. And Darnell, beaten down but unmoving, stood his ground. Because even if he was powerless in that moment, even if he had no badge, no weapon, no backup, he still had one job: protect Malik. The first crack in an ordinary morning revealed a storm no one expected. The baton came down with a terrifying swiftness. A loud crack split the air like a gunshot, silencing the terminal for a single, stunned second. Darnell's scream was swallowed by the gasps around him as pain exploded through his arm, white-hot and paralyzing. His shoulder gave first, followed by the brittle snap of bone in his forearm. His legs buckled, but instinct overpowered pain. His grip on Malik, his infant son cradled tightly to his chest, never loosened. One arm now hung useless, limp at his side, but the other wrapped protectively around the blue blanket holding his child. Passengers froze. Some clutched luggage. Others raised phones with trembling hands, uncertain whether to record or run. A woman stifled a scream. A man backed away, muttering, "Did he just hit him?" But no one stepped forward. Not yet. Darnell staggered but remained upright, breathing in shallow bursts. The scent of jet fuel drifted faintly from beyond the windows, mixing with the sterile chill of the terminal air. Blood drained from his face, but his eyes burned, not just from pain, but disbelief. "I didn't do anything," he gasped. Mitchell's voice cut through the tension, sharp and rehearsed. "You resisted a lawful order." "Hands where I can see them." "I'm holding my baby," Darnell shouted back, hoarse, his voice cracking under the weight of agony. "He's crying." I was just trying to calm him. But Mitchell wasn't listening. His hand hovered near his taser, his stance wide and aggressive. "Put the child down." "Now," Malik shrieked, the wail piercing and frantic, his tiny fists thrashing beneath the blanket. The sound should have softened something. It didn't. Darnell's thoughts spun wildly. He had done everything right, spoken respectfully, followed their instructions, tried to explain, and still he stood here, bleeding, injured, accused, but more than anything, he couldn't let go of Malik. Not here. Not like this. His son needed to feel safe, and Darnell was all he had left. He took a trembling step backward, nearly collapsing. His broken arm swayed unnaturally. Each movement sent fresh jolts of pain through his ribs. His vision blurred at the edges. "Please," he whispered, "don't hurt him." "Suspect is non-compliant," Darren barked into his shoulder radio. "Request backup near gate C2. Darnell shook his head, confused. "Suspect?" he muttered. "I'm not a—" But Mitchell lunged. He grabbed Darnell's shoulder and tried to force him down. Darnell twisted to shield Malik, absorbing the pressure across his ribs. His knees hit the floor with a jolt. A bolt of pain shot through his hip. He nearly blacked out. All around them, the crowd had grown. People whispered, unsure if they were witnessing a security risk or a tragedy. One man near the Starbucks counter murmured, "Why are they doing this to him?" Another responded, "Maybe he did something?" But more and more, eyes turned not to Darnell but to the officers. "Stop!" Darnell begged, his voice raw. "My son! Please, just let me hold him." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "Then stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Darnell cried, tears finally rising. "I can't even move my arm." The baby wailed louder, his voice ragged and frightened. To Darren and Mitchell, this was protocol. Another loud scene, another non-compliant traveler, but to Darnell it was a nightmare unraveling second by second. He had come here for a hearing, a custody case that would decide whether he was fit to raise Malik. And now he lay on the cold tile floor, arm broken, accused of violence he never committed, his child inches from harm. One hand still cradled Malik. It trembled, but never let go. Above him, Darren pulled out zip ties. "Don't move," he ordered, pressing a knee near Darnell's ribs. "I'm begging you," Darnell groaned. "He's all I have." No answer came. Instead, the world narrowed, screams in the background, boot steps echoing off linoleum, the hollow clang of a baton rolling across the tiles. But then something shifted. The atmosphere around the terminal changed. A ripple, like air bending before a storm. The crowd's murmurs turned into murmurs of recognition. Phones lowered slightly. Heads turned toward the entrance as the doors slid open with a hiss. A tall figure stepped through. Leather shoes clicked against tile. A travel bag hung over one shoulder. The man's gaze swept across the scene unfolding before him. Officers surrounding a man on the floor, blood on his sleeve, a baby crying against his chest. His face tightened, his steps halted, and for a moment no one recognized him. No one except one airline worker near the gate who blinked in disbelief. That's Judge Greer," the worker whispered to himself. The man at the terminal entrance remained still, watching, not speaking, not yet. Inside the fray, Darnell's head dipped forward, his body nearing collapse. But Malik's wails surged again, pulling him back. Through grit teeth, blood draining, and every ounce of dignity scraped raw, Darnell breathed only one thing. "Just hold on, little man. Daddy's got you." He didn't know someone was watching, someone who could change everything, someone who would. No one realized that someone with greater authority had just walked in. Judge Nathaniel Greer froze mid-step. The sound of shouting echoed across the terminal like warning bells. But what stopped him cold was the sight. Just feet away, a father hunched defensively over a crying infant, his arm twisted grotesquely behind his back by one uniformed officer, while another yanked violently at the baby's blanket. The child screamed, and the man, breathless and pale, clung to the infant with the trembling strength of someone who'd already lost too much. Greer's eyes widened as the scene registered fully. That was Darnell Rhodes. He recognized him immediately from the case file he had spent hours reviewing the night before. Widower, no criminal record, custody case pending, a man painted in reports as steady, soft-spoken, deeply committed to raising his son. Greer had expected to evaluate him in a quiet courtroom the next morning. Instead, here he was, his face pressed against a cold wall, lips trembling from both pain and urgency. "Please, don't hurt him," Darnell rasped, his voice raw. "He's just a baby." Darren Cole, the taller of the two officers, yanked harder at Darnell's shoulder. The crunch of muscle resisting its own limits made Greer flinch. The smaller officer, Mitchell Sykes, reached toward the baby with gloved hands, trying to pry him away. Darnell's other arm, the only one still mobile, tightened like a vice around Malik. Greer's pulse quickened. He looked around, scanning the sea of passengers. Most had stepped back, unsure of whether to intervene. Some had phones raised, recording. Others turned away, afraid. The terminal, moments ago filled with ordinary bustle, now vibrated with silent tension. Greer stepped forward instinctively, though he hadn't spoken yet. His badge, tucked away in his jacket, felt heavier than ever. Darnell's knees buckled slightly as Darren forced him lower, but he never released Malik. The baby's cries sliced through the air. The officers kept shouting, "Stop resisting!" as if repeating the phrase would make it true. But Darnell wasn't resisting. Greer could see that clearly now. He wasn't fighting back, wasn't reaching for anything. His only act of defiance was refusing to let go of his child. "Don't take him," Darnell choked out again, this time barely audible. Greer's jaw tensed. The scene burned into his memory. He had seen countless courtroom performances, people polished, rehearsed, presenting the version of themselves they hoped would win favor. But this wasn't performance. This was truth. And in that truth, Greer saw something that couldn't be measured in case files or legal arguments, a man who would break before he bent, not because of pride, but because he loved his child that much. And yet, he didn't reveal himself. Not yet. He needed to see what they would do without knowing they were being watched by someone who mattered, without knowing they were about to stand trial, not in the courtroom, but in the eyes of the very man who would soon decide the fate of the child they were trying to separate from his father. Mitchell leaned closer to Darnell, voice low and cold. "You should have just walked through like everybody else." Darnell, through clenched teeth and eyes full of both fire and tears, whispered, "I'm not leaving him." Another yank, another cry from Malik. Darnell's broken arm trembled, blood trickling beneath his sleeve. Greer's breath came faster. He was a judge, a man of law. But right now, this was more than law. This was humanity breaking in broad daylight. A nearby woman gasped. A man cursed under his breath. Yet no one moved forward. Greer's fingers curled tightly around the strap of his bag. For a split second, he considered how different this moment could have been. If he had arrived 10 minutes later, he might have sat behind the bench the next morning and never known this had happened. He might have listened to airport reports that painted Darnell as agitated or non-compliant. He might have believed them. But fate had pulled back the curtain. He stepped closer, still unnoticed. He studied the officers, how Darren's expression wasn't one of concern, but control. How Mitchell's glance darted toward bystanders, not to check for help, but to ensure no one interfered. Greer's voice wanted to shout, but something stopped him. One breath longer, he told himself. 1 second more. Let them show their full hand. Darnell groaned again, slumping against the wall, his head low but his grip on Malik unshaken. And that's when Mitchell said something Greer would never forget. "If he drops the baby, we cuff him. If not, keep twisting." Greer's entire body stiffened. That was it. That was the moment. He stepped forward, faster this time, heart pounding, mouth dry. Enough watching, enough waiting, enough silence. He inhaled, lips parting to speak, his hand already reaching for his ID. What he witnessed in that instant would change not only the custody case but the fate of the entire airport. The word stopped time. The security officers froze, batons half raised, mouths slightly open as if caught mid-breath. The terminal buzzed with tension, passengers holding their phones higher, recording, whispering, inching closer but still uncertain whether they were watching a tragedy or a turning point. Darnell, slumped against the wall with blood on his shirt and his arm hanging limp, barely registered the voice at first. He blinked through the pain, focusing on the man striding forward. Greer's eyes were cold fire. He pulled a leather wallet from his coat pocket and flipped it open, revealing a badge and court identification. His voice rang out again, clear and unmistakably authoritative. "I am Judge Nathaniel Greer, presiding over the Rhodes custody hearing." "Release that man." Now Mitchell shifted uneasily, taking a step back. Darren, however, stood his ground. His knuckles tightened around the baton, his jaw clenched. He posed a threat, he said through gritted teeth, not to Greer, but as if trying to convince himself. We were following standard protocol. Greer didn't flinch. Your protocol nearly crushed a child's skull. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Darnell, grimacing from the pain, slowly raised his head. Sweat beaded along his brow, and every breath seemed to grind through shattered bone, but his voice came steady. I only held my son. The words silenced the terminal more than Greer's command had. Darren's stance faltered. Greer's gaze didn't leave Darren's face, but he addressed the room. Get medical assistance here immediately. That's not a request. No one moved. The paramedics were already visible beyond the gate, held back by another uniformed officer who clearly didn't know what to do. The chain of command had twisted itself into knots. Passengers were now openly angry. Someone shouted, "Let the medics through!" Another chimed in, "We saw everything." Greer turned to a nearby airport worker. "You, get your supervisor." Now. The man nodded and ran off. Darren and Mitchell exchanged glances, subtle, nervous. Greer noticed. Their hesitation wasn't about guilt. It was about something else, someone else. Greer had been in too many courtrooms not to recognize the flicker of men who were waiting for higher orders. This wasn't hesitation born of fear. It was hesitation born of calculation. He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough that the cameras wouldn't catch it, but the officers would. You're not worried about protocol. You're worried about who's watching. Darnell let out a rough breath and tried to adjust Malik, who whimpered quietly against his chest. Even now, with his arm barely usable, Darnell refused to let go of the baby. Greer's chest tightened. He'd read about Darnell's life, about the custody dispute, the in-laws pushing for guardianship, but nothing in the court files had prepared him for this man, bleeding and broken, still anchored in purpose. "Sir," Mitchell said finally, his voice a fraction lower, "we were acting under instructions." Greer's attention snapped to him. Instructions from who? Neither man answered. Their silence was the loudest sound in the room. The paramedics finally pushed past the blockade, rushing to Darnell. One crouched beside him while the other began unfastening a sling from their emergency kit. Darnell flinched when they touched his shoulder, but his grip on Malik didn't loosen. "We need to move him to a stretcher," one medic said softly. "No," Darnell murmured. "Not without Malik." Greer nodded. "You'll carry them both." As the medics worked, more airport staff arrived, including a red-faced supervisor in a navy vest and tie. He tried to speak but faltered when Greer turned to him. "I want a copy of every camera feed from this terminal," the judge ordered, "from the last 15 minutes, and I want to know why these officers were instructed to intervene with this man." Now, the supervisor stammered, We'll get that to you immediately, Your Honor." Behind Greer, Darren and Mitchell stood stiff, their expressions unreadable, but their hands were no longer on their weapons. And yet, something about the way they stayed still, something about how they didn't look surprised by Greer's authority, left him uneasy. Their glances weren't just toward each other now, they were toward the distant hallway near airport operations, where someone else might be watching, someone whose name had yet to be spoken. There was a larger game at play. Greer's gut told him this wasn't over. He watched as the medics gently hoisted Darnell onto a stretcher, Malik still tucked tightly against his father's chest, blue blanket curled around them both like armor. Greer's voice dropped to a whisper, audible only to himself. "This isn't just abuse of power. This is something worse." The cameras kept rolling, capturing the moment that had already begun to go viral. Darnell's bloodied shirt, the brace, the baby's frightened face, and Greer standing between a wounded man and a system that had tried to erase him. As the stretcher began to move and the officers remained frozen in place, Greer looked back once more, eyes narrowed. "There's a protocol behind this protocol," he thought, "and I'm going to find it." Because now it was no longer about clearing Darnell's name in a custody case. Now it was about pulling the thread that might unravel something much deeper. The scene began to settle, but beneath the surface, something had been disturbed, something dangerous and hidden, now forced into light. Greer sensed this was not just about two men abusing their power, it was about a system protecting itself. "Step back. We need to secure the suspect first," Darren barked, raising one hand to stop the approaching paramedics. The medics hesitated just feet away, their equipment bags slung over their shoulders, eyes darting between the injured man on the floor and the uniformed barrier in their path. Darnell lay half-slumped against the wall, his face pale, his breathing shallow, one arm visibly disfigured and trembling, but his other hand still held tight to his son. Malik whimpered softly in his father's grip, his tiny body rising and falling with each broken breath Darnell took. The baby's cries were now softer, confused and exhausted. A murmur spread through the gathered crowd like a growing wave. "He's not resisting. He's bleeding," shouted a young man in a varsity jacket from the back of the crowd. Several others nodded, phones held high, capturing every moment. The mood shifted sharply, no longer just concerned curiosity, it was outrage, ready to boil. Judge Nathaniel Greer didn't wait. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the officers and the medics. His stance was calm but firm, shoulders squared, voice sharp as he said, "They're not your concern right now. That man needs immediate medical attention." Darren's grip tightened on his baton, but Mitchell's hesitation showed first. The crowd's voices rose again, some pleading, others demanding. It was no longer a controlled scene. The authority in Greer's voice made it clear something had shifted. The medics took the cue and stepped past the officers, kneeling beside Darnell with clinical precision. Greer knelt next to them, watching closely. Darnell's lips were dry, his brow slick with sweat. The broken arm shook violently, muscles spasming, but even as the medics urged him to relax, to let go of his child for treatment, he refused. "I can't," Darnell whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Don't take him, please." Greer watched in stunned silence. He wasn't just witnessing pain, he was witnessing devotion, a raw, unwavering force that refused to be separated from its purpose. One medic tried again, gently. "Sir, you're hurt. We need you to let go for just a moment." But Darnell only gritted his teeth and tightened his hold, his body twisting away as if bracing for another strike. Greer turned to the medics and nodded. "Work around it," he said. "He's not letting go." As they began to stabilize his arm with Malik still pressed to his chest, a new voice cut through the noise. "What's going on here?" The tone was different, authoritative but cold. All heads turned as Captain Royce Turner stepped through the crowd. His presence was immediately commanding, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming. He looked older than Darren and Mitchell, with sharp gray eyes and a stiff jaw that rarely softened. He approached with calculated strides, taking in the chaos, the phones, the blood, the judge kneeling beside a civilian. Without slowing, Turner pointed at Greer. "Step away from the officer's work, sir." "You're interfering with the security operation." Greer rose slowly. His face showed no fear, only measured disappointment. "I'm not a bystander," he replied. "I'm Judge Nathaniel Greer. I am the presiding official on this man's custody case." Turner faltered mid-step. For a split second, his confident facade cracked and his eyes flickered, not with fear, but with recognition. He recovered quickly, straightening, but Greer saw it, the flicker of unease, the pause that revealed he had not expected to meet resistance, especially not from someone with authority. Turner's voice lowered, but the edge remained. "That may be, Judge, but this is an airport matter. We follow federal protocols here, and I follow the law," Greer answered, refusing to move. "And you are obstructing medical care for a man who is clearly not resisting, who has suffered a serious injury in the presence of witnesses while still holding his infant child. Your men have already crossed the line. Do not take another step in that direction." The standoff lasted only seconds, but the silence that followed was deafening. Greer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every man in that room knew the weight of what was being said. Darren and Mitchell stared at Turner, unsure whether to stand their ground or retreat. But Turner's next move was not what anyone expected. He turned his back on the medics and Greer and addressed a nearby officer in hushed tones. The younger man nodded and moved toward the security desk. Greer watched carefully. It was too calm, too practiced. This wasn't panic, it was containment. He stepped closer to Turner. "What is it you're trying to clean up?" he asked quietly. Turner didn't respond. In that moment, Greer looked back at Darnell. The father's arm was being secured, but his grip on Malik had never loosened. It didn't matter how much pain shot through his body, his priority was clear. And in that instant, Greer saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just brutality. It wasn't just two officers who lost control. There was choreography to the way Turner entered, the way the cameras had stopped recording moments earlier, the way orders were being whispered and not spoken aloud. This wasn't chaos, it was protection, but not of Darnell, of something far older, far darker. Greer turned back to Turner, whose gaze had shifted from smug dismissal to quiet calculation. It was no longer just a brutal assault, it was the opening crack in a wall of corruption. He thought cruelty in plain sight would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe, justice starts here. Shut it off. Captain Royce Turner's command sliced through the tension as two uniformed officers moved briskly toward the control room. Judge Nathaniel Greer's voice had barely cooled from his last order when he realized what was happening. He had instructed them to preserve every second of security footage, every angle, every clip, every breath of brutality captured by airport cameras. But Turner wasn't preserving anything. He was erasing it. "Those feeds are evidence," Greer shouted, his voice rising above the growing noise in the terminal. His expression tightened as he stepped toward the two officers, but they ignored him, eyes locked on their captain for confirmation. Turner gave a slight nod. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were reacting. Voices rose from the crowd like a slow-rolling wave, starting as murmurs and swelling into chants. "Justice! Justice!" someone called. Others joined in, some lifting phones higher to capture everything, unwilling to let the moment vanish behind closed doors. In the swirl of chaos, a man emerged from the crowd, gray hair, wrinkled eyes, and a calm, watchful presence that stood in contrast to the storm around him. Leonard Voss moved with purpose, his steps deliberate. Dressed in plain travel attire with a satchel hanging at his side, he walked up beside Greer and leaned in close. "I've seen this before," Voss whispered, his voice edged with grim certainty. "Same officers. Same tactics. They call it non-compliance, but those people never make it to their flights. Some don't make it home." Greer's jaw clenched. He didn't look at Voss, but his breath grew shallow, his eyes locked on Turner. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence," Voss replied. "You're not just dealing with two bad officers, Judge. You're standing in a pattern," Greer inhaled slowly, steadying his voice. "Then we don't just fight them, we expose them." He turned and looked at the crowd, then at the rows of phones capturing every second. "Make sure those videos get out," he instructed Voss, "before they try to scrub every frame." Voss nodded, already moving back toward the passengers. He tapped shoulders, whispered instructions, directed bystanders to email backups to outside sources. "Don't delete anything. Save it to the cloud. Don't stop filming," he urged in hushed tones. Near the checkpoint, Darnell Rhodes stirred. His body trembled, blood still darkening the sleeve of his shirt. He leaned against the wall, barely upright. The pain in his shattered arm pulsed like fire, but his other hand never loosened around Malik. The baby whimpered softly, his tiny fingers clenched in his father's shirt. Then, as if drawing strength from the very ground beneath him, Darnell pushed himself away from the wall. A hush fell over the crowd as he turned to face them. His body was broken, his face pale with pain, but his voice, raw and resolute, cut through the air like thunder. "Don't let them take my boy." The words hung in the terminal like a flare in the dark. Passengers fell silent. Even Turner blinked, caught off guard by the force behind that simple plea. Darnell's voice was not loud, but it carried a weight no volume could match. His knees buckled slightly, but he did not fall. His hand gripped Malik as if the child were the last anchor to a world spiraling out of control. The baby stirred in his arms, unaware of the war raging around him. From across the terminal, a teenage boy filming on his phone began to cry. A father held his own son tighter. Several passengers turned their cameras on Turner and his officers, their expressions no longer curious. Now they were angry. Turner's expression twisted. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the tide had turned. Moments earlier, the narrative had been in his control. Darnell had been just another disruption. But now, the crowd didn't see a threat. They saw a father. A man, broken but unbending. A man who held his child through pain, humiliation, and fear, and still refused to let go. Greer saw it too. He saw how one man's agony had become a mirror. Every face in the terminal reflected a different truth, but they all saw the same injustice now. Turner glanced toward the officers near the control room and shouted, "Delete the last 20 minutes." "Now, no," Greer snapped, stepping in front of him. "You do that, and this doesn't end in suspension. It ends in criminal court." Turner didn't respond, but the smirk he'd worn before had vanished. From the back of the crowd, Voss returned, panting slightly. Videos are backed up, multiple sources. They can't stop it now. Darnell's body sagged, the adrenaline starting to fade, but he stood. The airport, moments ago just another checkpoint in his journey, had become the place where a man's silent strength sparked something irreversible. The chants rose again, this time louder, unified, and Turner stood frozen in the eye of a storm he had created but could no longer command. The battle for control of the story had begun, and the truth was leaking through the cracks. Turner's voice sliced through the noise like a blade. "Take him to room 12, now!" His tone left no room for debate, and Darren and Mitchell snapped into motion, each grabbing an arm as Darnell stumbled forward, cradling Malik against his chest with his one good hand. The crowd erupted with outrage, their chants turning into a surge of angry voices, but no one dared cross the thin line between protest and obstruction. Judge Greer moved instantly, following close behind, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as the group disappeared through a locked side door, away from the public eye. Room 12 was a grim pocket buried in the belly of Eastway International Airport. Bare walls, a buzzing fluorescent light overhead, and no windows to remind anyone that daylight still existed. It was a place built not for conversation, but for control. Darren shoved the door open while Mitchell all but dragged Darnell inside. The father grunted in pain as his injured arm bumped the doorway, but he didn't cry out. He only tightened his grip around Malik, who whimpered faintly, still wrapped in his blue blanket, sensing the tension in the air. "Sit him down," Turner ordered, striding in behind them. His boots clicked on the tile floor as he closed the door with a deliberate thud. Darnell collapsed into a metal chair, his body hunched, shoulders trembling with the weight of pain and exhaustion. Malik squirmed slightly, and Darnell rocked him gently, his breath shallow but steady. Blood stained the cuff of his sleeve. One side of his face had started to swell, and his knuckles were scraped raw. Greer stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly, eyes flicking between each officer in the room. His jaw was locked, but his silence was tactical. He wanted them to speak first. Turner removed his cap and dropped it on the table. He leaned in slowly, his voice low and cold. "This case was supposed to be closed before it ever reached court." The words dropped like a stone in the silence. Greer's head turned slightly. There it was, confirmation of everything he had begun to suspect. This wasn't about security protocol or a misunderstanding. This was calculated. "You mean sabotaged," Greer replied, his voice sharp. Turner straightened. "Call it what you like." "The man's unstable. We had reports. He was never supposed to make it to that courtroom. You fabricated those reports," Greer said evenly, "and now you've assaulted a man in front of 24 witnesses." Turner scoffed and gestured at Darnell. "Look at him. He's falling apart." Darnell looked up then, his face pale but his eyes blazing. "You can break my body," he said, voice rasping through clenched teeth, "but you will never make me drop him." His words didn't rise in volume, but the conviction behind them shook the room. Even Mitchell looked away. Darren stood rigid, clutching his belt like a shield. Greer stepped forward slowly, the tension in his shoulders now visible. He crouched beside Darnell, careful not to touch him. "Do you need medical attention?" he asked quietly. Darnell's head barely moved. "Not until he's safe." Turner stepped between them. "This is not your courtroom, Judge." Greer stood up slowly. His voice remained composed, but steel ran beneath it. "You're right. It's worse, because in a courtroom, men like you can't hide behind badges." "You're interfering in a security investigation," Turner snapped, trying to regain ground. "This isn't an investigation," Greer countered, eyes locking with his. "It's a cover-up." Mitchell shifted nervously, glancing toward Darren, whose mouth twitched like he wanted to speak but couldn't. The silence from the officers wasn't just discomfort, it was guilt. Malik whimpered again, a soft, confused sound that pierced the heavy quiet. Darnell instinctively adjusted the blanket, whispering, "Shh, I've got you. Daddy's here." That single act, gentle, instinctual, and defiant, broke something in the room. Turner's face tightened, but Greer saw something else. Fear. Not fear of Darnell, but fear of exposure. The plan was unraveling. "You assaulted a father in public, injured him while he held his child," Greer said, voice growing louder, more deliberate. "Then you dragged him into a locked room to silence him." "That's not procedure. That's intent." Turner's eyes narrowed. "You think anyone's going to believe him over my team?" Greer leaned in, his face inches from Turner's. "They'll believe me." For a moment, Turner didn't move. Then he gave a slow, almost amused smile. "You think your word means more than ours? We've buried worse." Darnell exhaled sharply, and for a moment it seemed like he would pass out, but he straightened again, breathing through his pain. "You can try to erase me," he whispered, "but I will never disappear." A long silence followed. Then Greer took out his phone, raised it chest level, and began recording. "You're threatening a federal judge," he said flatly. "Keep talking." Turner's face turned to stone. "You'll regret this." "No," Greer replied. "You will." Just then, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy, uncertain. A voice called out, muffled through the door. "Sir?" "Someone's coming in." Greer's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The door creaked open, revealing the nervous face of a young officer, Elias Ward. He stepped in hesitantly, avoiding Turner's glare. "Sir, there's something you need to know," he said, eyes darting to Darnell. But that moment would come later. For now, Turner had lost control of the room. The public was watching, the judge had heard everything, and a line had been crossed that could no longer be ignored. Greer turned one last time to face him, voice steady, gaze unwavering. "This is no longer a custody case, it's a crime scene." The room itself felt like a courtroom, and Turner had already begun to lose. Elias Ward hesitated at the threshold of the holding room, the thick silence inside pressing against him like a wall. The windowless space was dimly lit, the overhead bulb casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Captain Turner stood with his arms folded, jaw tight, while Darren and Mitchell loomed near the back wall. Darnell sat slumped in a metal chair, his face pale, lips cracked, eyes fluttering in and out of focus. Malik stirred faintly in his arms, the baby's soft cries muffled against his father's chest. Judge Greer stood near the door, his posture rigid, gaze sharp as a blade. Ward stepped inside, the door creaking as it swung shut behind him. The noise drew everyone's attention. He swallowed hard. "I need a word," Ward said, his voice just above a whisper, though the room was small enough for every syllable to echo. His eyes flicked toward Darnell, then to Turner, then back again. Turner narrowed his gaze. "This isn't the time." But Ward didn't back away. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a log report from the surveillance system. "I know where the footage is," Ward said, his tone low but certain. "The system backs it up, automatically. Every feed from the terminal is mirrored off-site. They can shut down the cameras, sure, but they can't touch the backup, not without a separate clearance." The room changed. In the space of a heartbeat, the power shifted, quiet but unmistakable. Turner's jaw clenched tighter. "You've said enough," he snapped. "Get out." Now Ward didn't move. He looked at Darnell again, his face bloodied, his arm twisted and bound against his torso, but still holding his son with the unshaken grip of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything left to protect. That image struck Ward hard. "Someone has to say it," Ward muttered, almost to himself. Greer stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the young officer. "Where is it backed up?" Ward met his gaze. "A remote server tied to the Transit Authority's legal audit archive. It's not on the airport grid, but someone's already trying to access it, someone with clearance higher than mine." Darnell stirred at the words, lifting his head just enough to look at Ward. Despite the haze of pain clouding his vision, he understood. A faint smile broke through the bruises, weak but real. "Thank you," Darnell whispered, barely audible. Turner stepped forward, his voice rising. "Officer Ward, you're dismissed." Effective immediately, Greer didn't flinch. "He's not going anywhere." I said, "You don't get to say anything anymore," Greer cut in sharply. His voice, calm and measured until now, was aligned with steel. "You've broken protocol, tampered with evidence, obstructed medical care, and escalated a civil dispute into a criminal crisis. The only thing you're going to do now is step back and listen." Outside the walls, the muffled roar of protest swelled. What had begun as scattered shouts had grown into rhythmic chants. The crowd wasn't leaving. They weren't forgetting. Turner stepped back slowly, but his eyes held a quiet fury. He wasn't used to losing control. Greer turned to Ward. "You need to secure that footage. You'll have help." Ward nodded once, then turned and slipped back out of the room, the door closing gently behind him. A long silence settled. Greer walked over to Darnell and crouched beside him. Malik's soft breathing filled the room. The judge looked into the man's tired, pain-filled eyes and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady. "Your fight is not over, it's only beginning." The irony of the moment clung thick in the air. Turner had believed that isolating Darnell in a room with no witnesses would bury the truth. But instead, his plan had opened a door to something far greater. Ward's quiet courage had lit the first spark, and the fire was spreading. The walls of silence were beginning to tremble and cracks of truth shone through. The image struck like lightning across every screen in the country. Darnell Rhodes, blood on his temple, cradling his child with a shattered arm, surrounded by officers in uniforms that no longer symbolized safety. Passenger videos had leaked online faster than Captain Turner's men could sweep the scene. Within hours, the footage went viral. News anchors replayed the moment frame by frame. Commentators debated policy, while activists called it what it was: brutality in plain sight. But in the sterile quiet of Crestview Medical's emergency wing, the noise outside meant nothing to Darnell. Pain throbbed from his shoulder down to his fingers, but he refused all sedatives. "Not if it makes me drop him," he murmured to the nurse, eyes locked on the sleeping form of Malik lying against his chest. A young doctor adjusted the sling holding Darnell's arm and paused. "You should rest." This was a compound fracture. You're lucky it didn't sever the nerve. Darnell didn't respond. His gaze didn't shift. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was holding on to the one thing they had tried to take from him: his child. Every breath he took reminded him of the baton's weight, of the humiliation, of the silence he refused to let bury the truth. In a private office across town, Judge Nathaniel Greer paced behind his desk. The emergency injunction had gone through. Darnell was out of custody, at least for now, but Greer knew this was only the beginning. The airport's Internal Oversight Committee, already under suspicion, had a history of quietly deleting footage. They labeled cases like Darnell's as escalated incidents, buried them under red tape, and hoped the noise died down. But this time, there was a wrinkle they hadn't accounted for: Officer Elias Ward. Greer sat down heavily and opened a locked drawer, pulling out a small notepad. Names, connections, potential allies. He scribbled quickly, then underlined one word: footage. The off-site recording Ward had whispered about. It existed. But for how long? Greer had worked long enough in the system to know how quickly evidence vanished when power was threatened. He picked up the phone. Leonard Voss answered on the second ring. "You saw the broadcast?" "I did," Greer said. "It's time." Voss didn't need clarification. "Ward's ready?" "He's scared," Greer admitted, "but not backing out. He's agreed to meet us tonight. We can't delay. Turner will be erasing everything by morning." The attorney's voice was sharp. "Where?" "My chambers. No surveillance there. Bring a secure drive." That night, under the cover of darkness, a small group gathered in Greer's office. The blinds were drawn, the lights dimmed. Elias Ward entered last, clutching a data stick in trembling hands. He looked younger than his badge suggested. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he slid the drive across the desk. "This is one of the backups," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's from the North Wing camera." "The others. I couldn't get them in time." Greer leaned forward, his fingers brushing the drive. "This one's enough." Ward looked down, ashamed. "They'll come after me." Greer didn't offer empty comfort. "Then we'll make sure what you did matters." Voss opened a laptop and inserted the drive. The room fell silent as the video played. There it was, undeniable. Darren Cole lifting his baton, Malik's cry, the sharp swing, Darnell shielding his child, blood blooming on the floor. There was no aggression, no resistance, only a father refusing to let go. Voss whispered, "This will bury them." "No," Greer corrected, his voice low but sure. "This will expose them. Burying is what they've done for years. We're pulling everything to the surface." Just then, Greer's assistant knocked, then cracked open the door. "Sir, another package, unmarked. It's addressed to you." Greer frowned, opening the envelope. Inside was a printout, a partial roster of the airport's oversight board. Several names were circled. One stood out: Raymond Chase, Director of Internal Affairs. Greer's lips tightened. Chase was known for one thing: cleaning up messes before they reached public ears. "This isn't just airport security anymore," Greer muttered. "This goes higher." Ward looked up, fear in his eyes. "That list, it's been passed around before." Everyone on it signed off on the airport's containment protocols. I didn't know what it meant at first. Voss stood, pacing now. "Then we bring them all in. Names, titles, the works. But first, we make this public ward." Hesitated. "There's a server room under the East Terminal. That's where the rest of the archives are. But if they know I gave you this—" Greer met his gaze. "You did the right thing, officer. And we're going to protect you. But we need everything. Can you get us in?" Ward nodded slowly. "I can try." Outside, the wind howled against the tall windows as if echoing the rising storm. In the distance, sirens wailed, not of danger, but of reckoning. The plan was in motion now. No turning back. And in the quiet hospital room, unaware of the alliances forming in his name, Darnell sat awake, watching Malik breathe. He thought of the trial ahead, of the faces that had watched him suffer and said nothing. His resolve sharpened like steel against stone. This was no longer just about custody. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about truth. And the child sleeping against his chest deserved to grow up in a world where that truth could breathe freely. The case was no longer confined to a courtroom. It had become a battle for truth itself. "Play the footage," Judge Nathaniel Greer said, his voice steady but sharp, echoing across the packed courtroom. The lights dimmed slightly as the projection screen buzzed to life. Every eye turned forward, and a tense silence settled like a blanket over the room. The grainy airport footage flickered into view. It began with Darnell Rhodes walking through Eastway International, cradling Malik in one arm, a diaper bag slung over his shoulder. He appeared calm, focused, and fully attentive to the infant nestled against him. There was no aggression, no threat. Then came the moment that changed everything. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the video showed Officers Darren Cole and Mitchell Sykes confronting Darnell, their body language aggressive and accusatory. Darren's hand gripped the baton at his belt. Mitchell blocked Darnell's path. No sound played, only the cold clarity of movement and timing. Darnell, visibly confused, gestured to the documents in his bag. Then, without warning, Darren struck. The baton came down hard across Darnell's arm, sending the father reeling into the wall. The blow caused Malik to jolt, his tiny arms flailing as Darnell struggled to keep his grip. A woman in the gallery put her hand over her mouth. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God!" But the courtroom remained transfixed. On the stand, Royce Turner stiffened, his jaw clenched. He had hoped this moment would never see the light of day. Judge Greer leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "This is the same footage Officer Ward retrieved from the off-site backup, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," said Leonard Voss, rising from the defense table. His tone was crisp, but beneath it ran a current of quiet anger. This was the version the airport committee never meant to reach the public. The original feed had been deleted from central storage, an internal decision, conveniently undocumented. Greer nodded slowly. "Continue." Voss turned toward the screen, letting the silence drag a moment longer. Then he stepped into the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, does this look like a man resisting arrest? Or a father protecting his child?" Murmurs echoed. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. District Attorney Halbrook, flustered, stood and objected to the emotional framing of the footage, but Greer raised a hand. "Overruled. The footage speaks for itself." Turner's face darkened. He tried to recover, sitting straighter, adjusting his jacket, but he wasn't used to being questioned, not like this, not publicly. He had spent years cloaked in authority, confident no one would ever challenge the reports his men filed. Now he was exposed, center stage. "Captain Turner," Voss said, pivoting to face him, "in your written report, you claimed Mr. Rhodes showed signs of violent resistance. You wrote he threatened Officer Sykes. Is that correct?" "Yes," Turner said tightly. "And is that claim visible anywhere in the footage we just saw?" Turner hesitated, then replied, "The footage lacks audio." "Body language can often be misleading." "Misleading?" Voss repeated, raising an eyebrow. He turned to the screen again, pointing at the moment Darren struck Darnell while he held Malik. "Is this misleading, Captain? Or is this brutality?" Objection rose from the prosecution again, but Greer didn't even look up. "Overruled." Turner cleared his throat, but the sweat glistening at his temple betrayed him. His confidence, once towering, began to crumble with every passing second. Voss moved in, his voice colder now, the rhythm deliberate. How many complaints were filed against Officers Cole and Sykes in the past 3 years? Objection, irrelevant, the prosecutor barked. Sustained, only if unrelated, Greer replied, his tone calm. But if it speaks to a pattern of abuse, Mr. Voss, proceed. Voss picked up a manila folder and flipped it open. 11 complaints, Your Honor. 11 reports of misconduct, filed by travelers citing racial profiling, physical intimidation, and excessive force. All swept under the rug by a single name on the final review page, Captain Royce Turner. The tension snapped. Audible gasps echoed. A man in the back muttered, "It was all covered up." Turner gripped the witness stand, knuckles whitening. "This isn't a case about one officer," Voss said, turning to the jury. "It's about a system. A system built to protect itself at the expense of people like Darnell Rhodes, a man who walked into an airport to attend a custody hearing and left with his arm shattered, accused, humiliated, but still holding his child." Across the room, Darnell sat silent. His right arm remained braced against his chest, stiff from healing but unmoving, as if refusing to show weakness. Malik sat in his lap, calm now, thumb in his mouth, his other hand clinging to the edge of his father's jacket. Darnell's eyes never left Turner. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because the courtroom was speaking for him. A younger reporter scribbled frantically in her notepad. An older man beside her shook his head in disbelief. In the second row, a group of activists nodded in solidarity. The tide had turned. And still, the screen stayed on. Frame after frame of injustice played out in grainy black and white, proving what so many had tried to deny. Turner looked smaller now, surrounded by truth he could no longer control. Voss returned to his seat, calm but satisfied, having peeled away the last layer of the lie. Greer finally spoke. "Let the court note that the evidence presented today, combined with eyewitness testimony and Officer Ward's sworn affidavit, will be admitted in full. A ruling on charges against Officer Cole and Officer Sykes will be addressed separately." He looked to Turner, his voice slow and deliberate. "And as for you, Captain Turner, I suggest you prepare to answer for more than just this report." Outside, protesters gathered, their chants echoing through the halls. Inside, truth hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Darnell closed his eyes, breathing deep. He had not come to fight a system, but now that he stood within its chambers, the weight of his pain carried something far greater. Justice, once whispered, now roared through the halls of the court. Ward's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the witness stand. The courtroom had fallen into an eerie silence, every eye trained on the young officer whose testimony could upend everything. His badge shimmered faintly under the courtroom lights, but his voice, though soft, cut sharper than any uniform ever could. "I was told to keep quiet," Ward began, his voice cracking slightly. "But I can't carry this anymore." Greer leaned forward from the bench, his expression unreadable. The gallery held its breath. Reporters paused their notepads mid-scratch. Even the clicking cameras slowed, waiting for the words that could ignite the courtroom. Ward exhaled shakily and continued. "Captain Turner instructed us that morning to monitor a traveler matching Mr. Rhodes's description. He said the goal was to document any instability, especially anything that would look bad in court. He made it clear it wasn't about safety. It was about making him look unfit as a father." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Darnell's face, already worn from weeks of stress and pain, remained still. Only his eyes flickered, deep, unreadable pools that reflected both sorrow and quiet vindication. He reached down and steadied Malik on his lap, cradling the child with his good arm as if anchoring himself to the moment. Across the aisle, Turner sat unmoved, jaw locked tight. Darren and Mitchell flanked him, staring straight ahead, trying to maintain a mask of professionalism that now rang hollow. But their stillness didn't hide the sweat beading at their temples or the subtle twitch in Mitchell's fingers. Ward wiped his palms on his trousers and pressed on. "After the incident, I tried to report it to Internal Affairs. They never responded. I found out later they were forwarding complaints straight back to Turner." A murmur rose from the gallery, low, tense, like a building storm. Greer raised a hand, signaling for silence, but his stern expression betrayed something deeper. Fury. Controlled, precise, but unmistakable. Voss, seated at the prosecution's table, stood slowly. "Officer Ward, are you saying there was a coordinated effort to discredit Mr. Rhodes as a father by abusing his rights at the airport?" "Yes," Ward replied, his voice firmer now. "It was never about airport security. It was about destroying this man's credibility before he ever stepped into court." Darnell looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. His mind flooded with images: the shove against the wall, the crack of bone, Malik's terrified cry. He had thought that was the worst of it. But this revelation, that it was all deliberate, not just a moment of bias but a calculated move, hit deeper than any Baton ever could. "Thank you," Voss said, nodding to Ward before stepping back. Greer stood from the bench. The entire room followed instinctively, sensing what was about to come. His gavel rested in one hand, his other clenched tightly at his side. "This court has heard testimony that suggests not only a grave misuse of authority," Greer said slowly, "but an attempt to pervert the course of justice by targeting a father during his most vulnerable hour." Turner's lip twitched. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. "Effective immediately," Greer continued. "Captain Royce Turner, Officer Darren Cole, and Officer Mitchell Sykes are hereby suspended from duty, pending criminal investigation. Any attempt to tamper with evidence or intimidate witnesses will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in solemn applause. Not one of celebration, but of recognition. Men who had once doubted Darnell now stood in solidarity, moved not just by his resilience, but by the truth that had finally clawed its way into the open. Darnell remained seated, Malik leaning into him, thumb in mouth. A single tear traced down Darnell's cheek. It wasn't from grief or anger. It was from the weight, the heavy, undeniable weight of having finally pulled the curtain back. Greer raised the gavel one last time. "And let it be known," he declared, "that this court will begin proceedings to enact immediate reforms in Eastway International Airport's security oversight. No family, no traveler will ever again be subject to unchecked abuse without accountability." The gavel slammed down. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters clamored for statements. But inside, in that solemn room where truth had finally spoken louder than silence, something had shifted. Something had changed. Darnell stood slowly, lifting Malik into his arms once more. The boy stirred, but did not cry. And as Darnell took one final glance toward the officers who had tried to break him, his grip on his son only tightened. He didn't need to speak. The image said everything. What began as one man's nightmare had become a nation's awakening. Darnell walked through Eastway International Airport with steady, deliberate steps, his left arm tucked close to his side beneath the tailored gray coat he now wore. Though healed in the medical sense, the arm still ached when the weather turned cold or when he slept too long on it. Malik trotted beside him, gripping Darnell's right hand tightly, his legs wobbly but determined, his small sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The terminal had changed. Not just the lighting or the signage. Those were cosmetic. What struck Darnell most was the tone, the human rhythm of the place. Officers stood near the security checkpoint, but instead of suspicion, their eyes carried welcome. He watched as a young black father ahead of him adjusted a stroller, and a uniformed guard leaned down, not to interrogate but to smile and help with a loose strap. Cameras lined the ceilings now, positioned with purpose, not secrecy, and people moved through the space with a sense of ease that hadn't existed before. This terminal, once a crucible of pain, had been reborn under the weight of consequence. Malik tugged at his coat. "Daddy, up," he mumbled. Darnell leaned down and lifted the boy with care, cradling him against his right side. The motion strained his healing arm slightly, but he did not flinch. A nearby traveler paused to hold the elevator door open, nodding politely at Darnell without recognition. That, too, was new. People once stared at him, either with judgment or pity. Now he was simply a man, carrying his child. That anonymity felt like victory. As they ascended to the departure level, Darnell's gaze swept across a glass wall that overlooked the security bay where it had all happened. The scene replayed in his mind without invitation. The strike, the blood, the frozen moment when Malik nearly slipped from his grasp. His jaw tightened. Not from anger, but from the discipline it took to remember and not be consumed by it. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Rhodes." Darnell turned. A young officer approached, early 20s, clean-shaven with sharp posture and nervous eyes. His badge read, R. Jackson. "I just wanted to say—" "Thank you, sir," Jackson said, his voice low but firm. "I trained under the new protocols. What you went through, it changed everything for us." Darnell studied the man's face. He saw no performance, only sincerity. "You carry that training with respect," Darnell replied. "That's all I ever wanted." Jackson nodded. "Yes, sir." "We do now." With a respectful glance at Malik, he stepped aside. Darnell exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling beneath the weight of memory. Each step forward was both a reclaiming and a reckoning. The world hadn't forgotten what happened. Far from it. But now it remembered for the right reasons. He passed a wall-mounted digital display scrolling news headlines. One caught his eye. Shield of Fathers expands legal aid to 4 more cities. Below it, a small image showed a support group gathering in a local community center. Fathers, mentors, boys. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had fire. All had hope. He had started the nonprofit with a single purpose: to make sure no other man had to choose between pain and parenthood in silence. Shield of Fathers had become more than advocacy. It was resistance through healing, a battleground for dignity. They reached the quiet alcove where it had all ended months ago. The floor had been retiled, but Darnell still saw the blood, felt the cold steel baton, heard the sharp snap of bone. Malik shifted in his arms, laying his head on Darnell's shoulder. "Almost done," Darnell whispered. From his coat pocket he pulled a folded sheet of paper, a letter from the Attorney General's office. Turner, Darren, and Mitchell had been formally indicted. Trial set. Internal investigations exposed years of misconduct. Their empire of silence had collapsed under sworn testimony, leaked memos, and video evidence too visceral to ignore. But for Darnell, the verdicts would never come from a courtroom alone. His justice had already begun, etched into the new training manuals officers studied, sewn into the words his nonprofit printed on banners. "We don't just protect, we prove." He saw it in the eyes of men who once thought themselves voiceless, now speaking with clarity in courtrooms, interviews, and custody hearings. Still, the scars throbbed. His arm would never fully return to its former strength. Certain angles still brought stabbing jolts at night, but he'd long stopped seeing that as a limitation. It was a reminder. He lowered Malik to the ground as they stood near the boarding gate. The boy looked up, eyes bright and curious. "Can we go now, Daddy?" Darnell smiled, then crouched so they were eye to eye. "We're already there, son." He stood again, watching the streams of travelers pass by. Different faces, different stories, but all moving forward, just as he had, just as he would continue to. He squeezed Malik's hand, and together they walked on. Sometimes the strongest verdict is written not in words, but in the unbroken grip of a father's hand. Moments later, the terminal froze, the judge himself walked through, and the tables turned instantly. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, abuse of authority, and sudden accountability when power is misused. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke thought about justice in public institutions, and inspire action toward dignity, equality, and reform.